produces a great soil amendment, and you know what's in it. Maybe that's not quite as true for community garden because you're really not quite sure what your fellow gardeners are putting in it. But another consideration is it saves on resources. Nobody's hauling away the excess stuff, and it also saves on greenhouse gases. If you put organic material in your garbage, it gets buried underground. There's no oxygen. That creates methane gas, serious greenhouse gas. So that's bad. So let me say.
I didn't really think about that. I was thinking it would get composted that way, but it doesn't because it's buried too deep.
Yeah.
It's a common misconception. There's actually no air because it's actually all in landfills. It's packed down by dirt, so no air gets through for it to compost.
Yeah. So here's a further introductory comment. I think it's a good idea to define what composting is because that kind of guides the whole process. So composting is the controlled decomposition of organic material to produce a stable, rich soil amendment. So let's look at some of the key words. Controlled means you're going to have to put some conscious effort into what goes into it and what happens to it. Organic material means it's just stuff that was recently a plant. I used to say everything that was once a plant. Well, plastic was once a plant, was once a dinosaur, but no time recently.
Right.
So, things that were plants recently, like the last couple of years.
And like wood, if it had a chunk of wood, that's not gonna get broken down anytime soon.
Not as a whole chunk, no.
Right,
Maybe if you broke it up.
wood chip it or something.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing is, I said it was a soil amendment. Typically, you do not plant things in compost. What you want to do is mix it with some other type of soil, maybe most likely native soil. And it is also not a very good mulch. It tends to dry out too much and blow away. So it's something you mix in with the soil. And the last thing I'll say about compost, or two last things, is that it is not it's not an alternative to garbage disposal. So certainly not everything from your house, not even everything organic, is going to go in there. And then maybe a final thing finally is we're only teaching one type of composting. It's what's called hot pile composting. It's a pile and it gets hot on the inside. There are other types of composting which don't particularly lend themselves to a community garden. There are things like bokashi, hugelkultur, and burial in place. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew and he can tell you how to do it.
All right, so I'm Andrew, and we're basically going to go over how to build a compost pile, which is pretty perfect because you guys actually have a 3-bin compost system already, which is pretty much our suggested system for composting, and I'll tell you the reasons why. Composting, like Rich said, involves, control. You have control over it, and you have to turn it. It needs air, moisture, and different elements in order for the materials in there to compost. So the reason this is perfect is because it's really easy to just take your big curved pitchfork and just flip it, boom, right over to the next one when you need time to turn it. And then you can start a new one in here. So this system is a lot better than, say, just one pile, because it's way easier to move it and get the air and get it flipped actually, so that the bottom material is also getting cooked from the sun just like the top material. Okay, so the next thing we're going to go over is what goes into this pile. So we basically have two elements. We have nitrogen elements, which are basically green elements. You're going to think of food scraps from your kitchen is probably the first thing that comes to mind for people. But then also we have green leaves, fresh leaves from a tree. I also brought in some weeds from my garden. Now, one thing about weeds is that you don't really want stems to go into your pile because they can very easily seed, start growing out of your pile. So usually what we'll do is pull the weed, chop the stem off, throw that in a bucket or something, and then what I'll do is I'll just let it sit in the sun somewhere else, and it'll just cook out into a brown material like this. And after like a couple weeks, it's probably not going to be seeded anymore, and then that can be used in the compost as a carbon. So let's get to carbon. Carbon is brown materials. So we have sticks, we have hay, we have brown leaves. Brown leaves is probably going to be the main source. A lot of people have trees. Most of us take our leaves after they fall, round them up, put them in black garbage bags where they go to our landfill. And the landfill, like Rich was saying, they're buried under dirt, they're not composting, they're not really doing much. I watched a documentary recently where they actually dug up this landfill in California, and they actually went down to over 100 years of time, so to speak, into this landfill. And they actually found items that were completely preserved exactly how they were 100 years ago. They had not decomposed at all. So if that gives you an idea of kind of why it would be important for things like this that could be a great soil amendment to go into our piles instead of our landfill pile. So, one important thing about composting that we have to realize is this is not a trash pile. So we're not going to just take things and just throw them in there and expect magic to happen overnight. We actually do have to do the work of basically chopping up this material. We want it to be fine. It doesn't have to be ground up into like powder, but it needs to be chopped into little smaller particles. So one way we do this is we'll just throw it on the ground, take like a shovel or something, chop it up like this, or you can also take like some choppers like this. I'm basically talking right now about how, we want the material to be a little smaller and finer, because that's just going to help the decomposition, that's going to help the microbes that are decomposing this stuff kind of get in all the cracks. And also what we've kind of covered while you were walking away is just what goes into it. So we have two elements. Green is nitrogen, brown is carbon. We want a 2/3 carbon to nitrogen ratio, so we want a little bit more brown material, less green, and that's going to be mainly from either hay, brown leaves, sticks. These are weeds and weed stems that I just dried out in the sun, so then we can then use them as a brown material.
Now the grass that's in there that's made of flowering head, would you try to get it out, or would you just let it be heated up by the compost like in the beds right now?
Okay,
like we have this has just come up on its own through the ground. So do we just chop it up and turn it in?
That's what I would actually suggest, is us just pulling all this out, chop it up, and we'll use that as compost. We probably won't want the stems, you can look at the roots. They're not really huge, so these ones will be okay, but if you pull it out and it's got like a creeping giant root, it looks like half of a carrot, that stuff is going to just regrow and seed that whole area, so you don't want that to go in there. Okay, so that being said, we can kind of start to construct. Now I don't know about this hay, I'm assuming that's more for cover.
It was for cover. We could use a little bit of it if we need some.
Okay, well we don't need too much, but what we're going to kind of do...
I haven't done this bed yet, that's my main task, and we opened it up to other gardeners.
Okay.
Some took advantage, I can see.
Well, we'll leave that because we got some material.
Okay.
Rich brought us a big bag of brown leaves.
You got that at Home Depot?
No, this is from his house.
Oh, it's just a Home Depot bag.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think about this bag, Rich? Can that be composted?
I think so.
Yeah,
It's
I think so,
compostable to me.
I think this bag could be composted, like cardboards and stuff like that are compostable. We just want to get them into smaller particles. So, I guess first thing we'll just kind of clear out this thing so we have a fresh thing to start with.
Are the things that are in there okay?
Let's see, what do we got in here? Looks like we got some root plugs. These
Those
are made.
not good.
These are actually okay. These are made from peat moss.
But the stuff on the outside isn't, is it? We can take them out of that.
I don't know. That doesn't look good.
It doesn't look good, yeah.
So-
Some of them I got pulled out and others I didn't, so.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll just start our pile in this middle bin for now.
Okay.
And
There's not, well, there's some.
yeah, we can maybe make that a test for later. Kind of go through that. So, we probably just use this middle bin for now. So the ideal compost pile that we recommend is at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet.
Okay.
Roughly, and the reason for that is that it creates enough density of material to essentially create the right environment and heat and everything. But that should never be a discouragement, so we don't want to tell people, oh, if you don't have enough, just don't start. No.
Yeah.
Anything can be composted, like any size of pile. It'll just be quicker if it's this large. So I'm going to kind of go through and just chop this up a little bit more.
That's what we didn't buy yet. Tool-wise.
Yeah, these are really good to get.
Yeah,
This is one of our teachers' favorites.
That's why I had some and I said no to them, not thinking that we would need them for anything. Nope, silly me.
And I don't think these will be an issue, really. I think it'll just cook out. If it does start to grow up, you can just chop it back down.
And when you're starting, you can be transferring from one to the other pretty much until
You do
you're...
it over time, right? So
Right.
eventually you're going to move it,
So yeah, about like,
turn it into the next one, right?
exactly. So basically we'll flip it maybe every week or two into another one. And that way, maybe we'll have 2 going at a time and 1 always open. That way we always have 1 we can
Place
flip
to flip
into.
it to.
Yeah. So this is just gonna kind of get
Mixing the brown and the
mixed
green.
up really good. If someone does have like a chipper or a shredder, like any sticks and stuff can go in there, just chipped up.
Okay.
And maybe something we could enlist from you guys and your gardeners is to get some more brown material for this. So like some leaves or chopped up sticks. Just so it's more of a 2/3 of brown ratio.
Okay. We'll probably have to do the straw for now. 'Cause
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say,
we could do some of the straw for
and we could use one to let it dry, the long
Yeah, we could dry
gummy
some stuff
weeds.
out.
now. Yeah, totally. Throw the weeds and stuff in there, dry them out. That'd be perfect. And then like cardboard, so we just kind of found this. It was floating around from the wind. It's really windy out here.
Yeah.
So I mean, this stuff is great. It has aeration. It's just another resource that would go in the
How
landfill.
small do you go then? Pretty small?
Yeah, we rip it up. I mean, as you can see, like that papery stuff can be a little bigger.
They always have boxes inside.
Absolutely.
Does it matter if they're like white clear boxes as long as it's cardboard? Or does it matter?
You definitely don't want anything that seems to have like a painting or like any other
Slick.
materials
Yeah.
on it.
Okay.
But yeah, in general, white's usually okay. But we don't want like a ton of cardboard,
No.
you know.
It'll take too long.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of want an even mixture of things.
And I'm sorry, what did you say, a third green, a third?
Yes, 1/3 is green material and 2/3 is brown material. And then, okay, another thing that we definitely need to talk about in Colorado is moisture. You want to kind of go over that for a second, Rich?
Oh, sure. The rule of thumb in composting is the pile should feel like a wrung out sponge. And the reason for that is, you folks as science teachers might know more about this than I do, but the little microorganisms live in a film on the organic material. They do not seem to live well underwater. So you're looking for a film on things.
Damp.
Pardon me?
Damp, but not soap.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but what seems here in eastern Colorado to stop composting is the pile gets dried out. So you want to be sprinkling water into it periodically and turning it over. Because what tends to happen is the outside of the pile gets dry,
Yeah.
and maybe the inside is too wet. So as Andrew is kind of doing here, fluff it up and then make sure that everything is moist.
And I'm sorry, you said to turn it how often?
Once a week, you said?
Yeah, once a week, maybe 2 weeks if you don't get to it. It doesn't have to be a religious thing. It's definitely not like an exact science, you know? So it doesn't have to be treated that way, otherwise it kind of takes the fun out of it. It's like this regimented thing you have to do. So yeah, every couple weeks. And one thing we'll do before we go too that's great is to cover it with like a black plastic after we moisten it. And that's going to help retain moisture and heat.
Okay.
And that will cook it a lot faster. Actually, we built a pile at the community garden in Denver, and 1 week later when we busted it open and we stuck a thermometer in there, it was already at 135 or 140 degrees, which is almost ideal temperature, and you could see the white mycelium just growing everywhere just in 1 week. So
Okay.
Pretty
What's
impressive.
too hot?
like above 160.
Okay.
I would definitely suggest getting one of these for you guys. They're really cheap. Compost thermometer or a long stick thermometer. Do we have access to a hose so we can just moisten those tabs up?
Yeah.
What do you got in here, Rick?
Coffee grounds.
Oh yeah.
Ooh, we can talk about that. There's almost, in a context like this, like near a school,
Yeah.
there's almost always a teacher's lounge, right?
You have coffee grounds.
My parents were teachers. Okay,
So are mine.
so yeah, no, coffee grounds count as greens, interestingly enough.
Really?
Yeah, for some reason,
Coffee grounds.
normal mortals would call it brown, but it's, in terms of composting, it's green. And coffee filters are okay to compost.
Okay.
But you should probably get unbleached.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're not the bleach ones.
Counted greens. Alrighty.
So I guess another thing we can talk about now is kind of what happens next. What do we do when it's all said and done? So maybe how long is this going to take, first of all, is a lot of people's question. You know, it's not going to just be ready for your spring soil if you start it in February. This is something that takes about 3 to 5 months in summertime and about 6 to 8 in colder months. So it's really an ideal thing to almost start 1 year and then plan on having a composted material for use by the next spring. And so then what we would do, we'd have sort of a brown material. It still's got some chunks of things in it, but it's starting to look like black gold is kind of what you would think of as compost. And so then this is a simple screen that Rich made, just some boards, like a chicken wire type of wire. And so you can just throw the compost on there and then just sift it around, and all the big chunks, just throw them right back in the pile. They'll break down more, and what you'll have underneath will be just a real beautiful compost, like what you would imagine when you see a bag of compost that you buy at the store, except way more rich. Because here's the greatest, I guess, benefit of doing it yourself is you can control when it's actually done and all the elements. A lot of manufacturers or sellers of compost are selling not a fully cooked product to people. They're selling a product that still needs to be cooked down and composted for several months before use. So a lot of times when you put that on your soil, it's going to heat your soil up a lot because it's still composting and breaking down. And this is basically so they can do it faster and just get it out of there. And then another thing that's really kind of frustrating is there's really no regulations on saying organic on your compost. So just because someone says this is organic compost, there's not really that much oversight saying that all the inputs that went into that compost were all organic materials and things like that, organically grown. So it's kind of one of those things where they can advertise it, but they don't have to prove it, and you can't really check it or test it unless you get independent lab testing done. So doing it yourself is so beneficial because the product that you come out with is probably 10 to 100 times better than what you would buy in a store, in my opinion.
Cool.
That's the greatest part about making it yourself. And it's fun. All right, what else can we...
And what about, like, we had them for a lab that we don't do,
Okay.
dedicated materials like that compost starter? Like, I think I may even have some in the shed somewhere.
Ah, good question.
It's like, you know, is it just little microbials that are supposedly dried out or something?
Yeah.
Well, the literature that we've encountered, Andrew and I have encountered, is that commercially sold compost starters are a complete ripoff.
Okay.
The reason for that is, even if it was probably good quality compost with a lot of microorganisms in it when it left the factory or when it was packaged, by the time it goes through the distribution system and sits on a retail shelf and gets to you, those microorganisms are probably dead.
Okay.
Another factor is what they're probably putting in there is microorganisms and some kind of nitrogen product. But there's plenty of nitrogen
Already.
available. And last but not least, just in, excuse the expression, but garden variety dirt, there's plenty of microorganisms.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
you don't
So
really
pretty
need
much
to buy.
the stuff that we have it is probably just dirt now, so
Yeah,
just throw it in the
Yeah.
yeah, I'd say throw it in.
Because
And,
we had it for some labs and I might as well get rid of it because we don't use it.
Another thing to think about too, which is really kind of goes under the radar, is that is not a natural microorganism to this
This
environment. So it's actually kind of like introducing foreign microorganisms, which most likely they'll just get killed by the ones that already exist here, or they'll just die because this isn't the environment that they would thrive in. But potentially, if you had enough of them and they did start thriving, you could actually kill off the natural microlife in your ecosystem. So that could be potentially, you know, devastating. And there's this stuff called bokashi actually that's being kind of commercially pushed now as a way to compost in your house without a smell. And it's like an anaerobic compost with no air. And so basically they're selling these microorganisms that you inoculate your food scraps with, and they break them down and ferment them, and then you're supposed to put this in your compost pile. But the thing is, like I said, this is mostly microorganisms from Japan and other countries, so it's actually kind of like a form of...
Introducing a foreign species.
Right, it could potentially be bad to our environment. So there's ways to gather more natural microorganisms. I'd invite everyone to look up indigenous microorganisms, and there's ways you can harvest the ones that already exist here and then add those to your soil amendments and stuff.
Okay.
so what do you think, Andrew? What should we do next to this pile?
I guess moisten it a little and then
I think so.
cover it up.
Yeah,
And then maybe we can talk about worms for just a minute.
sure.
Sweet.
Are you ladies interested in hearing at least a little bit about worms?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know our neighbor who couldn't stay, he had worms at home instead, so he's composting more than at his house.
So you wouldn't put worms in this one. You would do it separately.
No,
That's a
let's.
different thing.
Yeah.
You can.
Oh, were you asking? Do you put worms?
I
in?
said, could you? Yeah, or you could, or don't have to.
Well-
Ideally, no.
No.
It doesn't work.
No.
I mean,
Okay.
you can do anything. The question is, what's the result?
Yeah.
Uh,
they'd cook.
The answer to that is the worms only thrive in temperatures from about 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Gotcha.
Oh, so that's too hot.
Yeah.
So if your pile's getting to 130,
They don't
you're
like
making
Cooking worms.
it's a worm cemetery.
that. They would become part of the compost.
Yeah. So that's kind of the answer to that one.
So there's worm composting and hot composting. Two different things.
Yeah, and never the twain shall meet.
Gotcha.
So let's talk about the worm composting a little bit. I'll once again haul out my worm bin. worm bin. So it consists of 2 plastic totes. The outside tote doesn't need to be nearly this tall. All the outside tote is doing is catching liquid that is draining from the inside tote. So the outside one can be more like just a tray. Put that up there. So the real deal is you get a tote,
I'm panicking, sorry.
you drill some 1-inch size holes in the top, and ideally cover it with a screen. And then you probably want to drill some holes in the sides as well up towards the top. Cover those with screen. So what those are doing is they're cooling the bin and they're having oxygen because worms are animals, they need oxygen. But the screen is prevent them from escaping.
They don't want it coming out.
Yeah, worms, you know, like anything else, if they don't like their environment, they're going to take a hike. And unlike the organisms in the compost pile, worms can move around. So you don't want them, especially if you're storing these in your garage, your basement, or I'll even get to this, in your living room. You do not want them escaping.
I was going to say classroom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
classroom would work.
So you also put holes in the bottom. Let me see if I can tilt this up a little bit.
Okay.
And the reason for that is worms are not fish. If it gets too liquid for them, they will drown. Okay, so you want the material, you want the liquid to fall down. That's the purpose of the tray. Okay, so what do you put in the worm bin? 2 elements. One is shredded newspapers. If you take a newspaper and you look at it the way you would read it, if you rip it into strips from top to bottom, it will rip off in nice 1-2 inch wide strips. If you turn it 90 degrees and rip it the other way, you get a crazy quilt thing. So rip it from top to bottom. So half newspaper and half fall leaves like we had a little while ago. The reason for that is if you just use newspaper, you just created paper mache. And if it dries out, it's going to be like a rock and the worms won't do well. Okay, so that's the environment. How big a bin do you need and how many worms do you need? Okay, for each pound of kitchen waste, so carrots, tops of strawberries, broccoli, cauliflower, lettuce, all kinds of stuff like that, that maybe the typical salad ingredients, you have excess peelings. For every pound of that material, you need per week 1 square foot of surface area. So this is maybe 1.5 square feet. So that's 1.5 pounds. And then if you're going to put in 1.5 pounds, you need 3 pounds of worms. Because worms eat about half their weight in a week.
It's a bunch. Yeah.
Yeah, but the whole thing kind of self-regulates because if there's not very much food, then the worms will naturally decrease their population. On the other hand, if after a week you look in there and there's a lot of recognizable produce, that means you should probably hold off for a while. So it's kind of self-regulating. And then the other thing you want to do is get some newspaper and put that over the top. And that just keeps things a little darker for the worms. Worms really do not like the light. They are trying to flee the light. So here's another biology thing. Not all worms are the same. The worms we use for composting are, a common term is red wigglers. And the reason we pretty much stick with those is that their natural environment is sort of leaf litter. So they're in the top 4 to 6 inches of the leaf litter. That's what they like. that is easy for us as people to,
Provide
as she said, replicate. Lots of other worms dig these deep tunnels, and that's great for the natural environment, but it's difficult for us to replicate that.
Okay.
So you just order your worms in from someplace and get the right kind?
Yeah. There's a recommended company here in the Denver area called ABC Compost. Stands for Already Been Chewed. All right. So another question is, okay, once you've been, maybe we should talk about the life cycle. So about every week you probably, maybe back up. Every 2 or 3 days you want to be looking at your worms and seeing how they're doing. Are there some still alive? Is there stuff in there for them to eat? And you probably need to fluff up the worms plus material every 2 or 3 days. Once a week, you probably want to throw some more food in there. On a 3-month cycle, you want to be harvesting the compost and refreshing the bedding. So the question is, how do you get the worms separated from the compost? Okay, like we were saying a little while ago, worms do not like the light. So what you do is you put a plastic sheet on the ground or a surface. So maybe 4 feet by 4 feet or 5 by 5, anything that's waterproof. You dump the whole contents of your worm bin on that, and you make little pyramids that are like maybe 4 to 6 inches in diameter and maybe 2 or 3 inches high. So you make all these little pyramids. So what happens then is the worms not like, then you have to shine, either use sunlight or use like a bright light, interior bright light of some kind. And the worms try to avoid the light, so they're going to the middle of each of these little pyramids and the bottom. So what you do is you skim off the top of all the pyramids. So that's one cycle. And then you use the remaining stuff and build more pyramids. You do that a couple of times. You get to it's a matter of diminishing returns. At some point, you say to yourself, I've got a lot of worms left over and not much bedding. So then you're done. The stuff that you skimmed off, that's the worm compost. That's what you want to put in your garden to feed your plants.
Gotcha.
The remaining wormy material, that becomes the beginning of your next worm bin.
And that's every 3 months?
Every 3 months. Yeah. That's a good rule of thumb. But like everything else in life, you have to use a rule of reason and kind of look at what's going on. So you can get this done like maybe 4 times a year.
It's a quarter. It would be
Final if you're doing it in the classroom.
Oh, you folks in education, you're always key to
Extra
what's
credit.
going-
We got some ready labor when it's time for the separation of the worms.
Yeah, and I don't know, I can't remember because my kids are older, but they tell me that middle school age kids like worms.
No,
High school, I don't know.
not so much.
Yeah, probably, especially mostly the girls, at least the girls I went to high school with.
Middle school, the girls were braver than the boys
Extra credit.
back then.
Yeah. extra
High school,
credit.
it's a little bit random.
Yeah.
Sometimes the girls are the lead dissectors. So you never know.
Well, this is much cheaper than the can of worms, which is $100 and something bucks. So this is probably the better option.
Yeah. They're like, it's like we didn't cover in hot pile composting the style of bins.
Yeah.
And in hot composting, the style of bin probably doesn't make much difference, but you really need a good worm environment. And maybe like hot composting, I mean, you can spend like a couple $100 to buy a really fancy worm bin,
Yeah.
but you can make your own for
How often are you putting water in? Just
every 2 or
eyeballing
3
it?
days.
2-3 days. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's another point. You would know the answer to this, but I've been told that water directly out of the tap is not particularly good because it has too much chlorine
Right.
Can,
in it.
If you just let
Can.
it sit for a day.
So
yeah, like for aquariums, let it sit.
So what I do for whatever it's worth is I have a plastic watering can,
Yeah.
I fill it up with water and I just park it next to the worm bin. And then whenever I look at the worm bin, it looks like it needs more water, then that's the water that goes in the worm bin.
That's good to remember. Yeah. Same with goldfish.
Yeah.
That's what we used to do.
Yeah,
Let
kind
it
of like
sit
goldfish.
overnight. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of worm composting.
Okay. Cool. That'd be fun.
I've been, like I said, I've been wanting to do it forever. I just never have. So.
Yeah. So you can definitely get or come up with trays that are wider and longer and have more square feet, if you like.
Yeah, and not as deep. Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess maybe one last little thing about worms is worms do not have teeth. So one thing is they like soft material. And the second thing is they need a certain amount of gritty sort of material to further chop up what they eat. So some crushed eggshells are a good thing.
Is there anything not to put in there? You would...
Citrus,
Okay.
the same stuff that you do not put in a hot pile, meat, dairy, grease. Let's see.
So if your
They like
leftover
eggshell.
salad has dressing on it, don't put it in there, right? Don't.
I would say not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I mean,
no leftovers, just
I'd
chopped.
say, 1 gram is not going to be the end of Western civilization.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the extra bottle left over of salad dressing that you really don't like, don't throw that in.
Gotcha.
Can you think of anything else about worms that we need to talk about?
Well, I guess one other thing that can be done with the finished material is that we haven't talked about is teas. So you can make a compost tea or a vermicompost tea, and that's essentially just taking the finished material, putting it in a bucket or a trash can with water, and then getting air stones, which you can find at any growing supply store or fish tank supply store. And you basically just bubble it. These air stones produce a bunch of bubbles at once into the water that creates
You're doing
oxygen.
it into the bottom?
I would usually do it in a trash can or a bucket, and I would take the finished material, so the sifted worm compost or the sifted compost, and then I would put about 50-50 with water and compost, and then bubble it for 24 to 48 hours. And what that's going to do is help all the microorganisms really grow and thrive. And then that can be further diluted in half and then used to water all your plants or even just your soil beds to just enrich them with microorganisms and nutrients. So that's like one thing you can do to even get more out of your finished product essentially. And then another, teas are actually really great. I'm a huge fan of them. So another thing you can tea is your weeds. So basically any of the weeds, you don't want to use the stems again, but these are all plants that have a lot of really good elements in them. They're all strong and hardy. They grow almost anywhere through the concrete. So they contain elements of strength for plants. So you can take those weeds, bubble them in a bucket with water, and then filter it out, and you can water all your gardens with that also. There's what's called fermented plant juice or fermented fruit juice. I suggest looking up. I'm not going to get too much into it, but there's also methods of using those and natural sugars to harvest even more microorganisms and elements from nature that are good for your garden. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's infinite resources on the internet. Obviously, be picky. Don't look. One advice I would give is don't take internet sites as fact when it's clearly an advertiser of a product or just a blog. Look for the actual scientific source of that material because it is very abundant when it comes to composting and natural gardening.
Can you think of very much more about any aspect of composting that we really haven't covered?
I mean, we could cover the few things that you don't want too much of because of compression, maybe.
In general, hot pile composting or even worm composting, you don't want stuff like a brick, so you want to be fluffing it up so there's oxygen in it. The microorganisms like oxygen. there's not enough oxygen, then you get this anaerobic decomposition, which produces methane, and then you might as well have sent it to the dump. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I know, maybe we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about peculiarities of Colorado. There's a lot of literature about composting, but composting is different in, say, southern Alabama than it is in Colorado. Okay, the major thing here is this is a desert. From what I read about the 19th and 18th centuries, none of these trees would be here. This would be...
It's a grassland, so it should be.
Yeah, this is a upland desert.
Grass prairie, hopefully. Short
Pardon
grass
me?
prairie. Should
Short
be
grass
short grass
prairie?
prairie.
Yeah,
One step from desert.
yeah. So I think the major factor, the reason that composting doesn't happen around here is the piles aren't wet enough. So that means you have to turn them over, put water in them, and then cover them. We brought you some black plastic?
We had some, but you're good.
Oh, you already have some?
Yeah, we have a lot, but no, you're good.
Okay, well, we'll just use yours. Or you can use yours.
Yeah.
Let's see. The soils around here are very alkaline. I mean, there's exceptions to everything, but the soil tends to be alkaline. And what that means is manure is probably not a good thing. The reason is that
You're making it more.
it makes it more alkaline and increases the salt content. So it's a bad idea to go to the local horse farm or riding stable and buy manure, or the local cow feedlot and buy manure. That's probably not good. Some parts of the country have other types of soils, and they put lime in their soils. That just makes it more alkaline. So we probably don't want to do that here. Another material that you commonly encounter around here are pine needles. We've got lots of pine trees, right? I mean, it's nice organic material, it's just that it has evolved to resist decomposition.
Your coffee grounds are probably better because they're going to be acidic.
Yeah. So the problem with pine needles is that they just take a long time. This is not particularly just Colorado, but some people like me are enamored with roses, and you prune your roses and you wind up with thorns. Probably not good to put in your compost pile.
Stab your worms.
Stab yourself.
Yeah, worms probably don't like them either. That's what I can think of.